Hello, welcome to PC Jack. Today I'm going to show you how to overclock the RX 6950 XT. Now, my favourite way to overclock AMD cards is going to be using the Adrenaline driver, which has the built-in global tune-in software, which you can use for overclocking, undervolting, and just basic tweaks to your GPU. So to start, we're going to need to go to the Performance tab in Adrenaline and then go to Tuning, and then what we want to do is basically enable custom for everything that you can in the tune-in part of this software. So we're going to go Custom, and under GPU Tuning we're going to go Enable Advanced Control, and then the same thing for fan tuning, we're going to enable that, enable again, enable our power tuning, that's going to be very important, enable our VRAM tuning, and then enable advanced control. So before we get into any sort of overclocking, let's take a little bit of an overview of what is actually here. So starting over here at the top left, we've got our GPU tuning. So this is where we would focus on our core clock and our voltages. So over here you can see we can set a minimum frequency, and then we can set a maximum frequency. And then below that we have our voltage setting. Moving over to the right, we have our fan tuning. So this is where you can actually tune your fan and design your own custom fan curves. Enable or disable 0 RPM mode, which is where the fans don't spin up unless they're under load. And then below that we have our power tuning, which is basically where we can amend our power limit. Lastly, we have our VRAM tuning, which is where you can actually go in and you can amend the actual memory timings and speeds for the VRAM on your GPU. So you can see over here we have our max frequency we can go in, and we can also mess around with our memory timings. I wouldn't really touch those, to be honest. I'm not personally that experienced with touching memory timings for my GPU VRAM. So I would just stick to messing around with the actual frequency itself. Now, the very first thing I would do before we get into any overclocking or undervolting is actually just to max out this power limit, just drag it right across. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll draw power, especially when you're doing your undervolt, but it should help with achieving more stability, and also for overclocking, it will help you get a little bit more juice out of your card. So what I would basically do, with any RDNA 2 cards, I like to keep the minimum frequency and the maximum frequency within 100 MHz of each other just to achieve more stability. So an example of this would be to set our minimum frequency to 2619, and then that creates a 100 MHz delta between our minimum and max frequency, which should help with our overclock. So the actual process of overclocking is just increasing our frequency bit by bit until we reach instability and find that sweet spot. So literally all I would do is go into our max frequency and just put up by about 10 MHz at a time. So for now, let's go for 2730. And then again, like I said, we need to make sure we're within 100 MHz on that on the minimum frequency. So we'll change our minimum to 2630. And then you can click apply on that, and then you can go into any sort of synthetic benchmark or even games that you like to run. Test that, make sure it's stable, and then once you know it's stable, come back into the overclocking software and increase it bit by bit. So we could go again, we go 2740, 2640, and then apply again, and then just keep going through until you start to see maybe artifacting where there's glitches on the screen, or potentially you could find that the game might crash, for example. But it's going to vary from card to card, and you just got to find that sweet spot for yourself, and then you know where you're at. For me personally, I know for my card, I can push it to 2800 MHz, 27 on the minimum, and that's stable for myself. Now, the one thing you will notice in game, if you have a display that has your stats for your GPU, you'll probably see that your maximum frequency is actually a little bit lower in game. Now, it tends to be with AMD cards that it'll sort of be the sort of like around 50 MHz delta between the two. So you may find that, say for example, I was running this at 2800 MHz for my core clock. It's actually running about 2750 to 75 in game. So you just gotta have a mess around and see what works for you. Now, once you've settled on the overclock for your core clock, you can then move on to your VRAM tuning. So again, the same thing with this. I like to just go up a couple megahertz at a time. So all I would do is I'd go over here and go, so from 2248 I'd go to 2260, and then enable that, and then just keep going through until you reach instability. Now for me, I can hit around 2400 megahertz, and that will actually give me around about 50 megahertz less in game. Again, like I said, with that sort of delta you see in applications. So my overclock altogether is 2800 megahertz on the core clock, and then 2400 megahertz on my memory clock. And for that, I just keep the voltage at 1200 millivolts just to make sure we're achieving stability on that. You could potentially drop that a little further, but for me, I need to actually reduce my core clocks to actually get a lower voltage. Now, that might be all fine if you are looking to push your card to the absolute limit, but what if you're looking to be a little bit more power conscious and reduce the thermals as well as the actual power draw for your GPU? Well, that's where undervolting comes into play. And much like how you would do for an overclock, it's pretty similar steps, but what I tend to do is, again, you need to figure out the actual speed of your card in game, and what I find for mine, I like to set mine at 2600 for our max frequency, and again that 100 megahertz delta, so we go 2500 on our minimum. And then what you would do at this time is actually look at the voltage for our GPU and just drop it down like maybe around 10 millivolts at a time, so you could go 1190, and then again you would apply that, test it out, see if it's working for you, and if you are stable you can keep reducing it even more, so you would again go 1180 and then test, and so on and so forth. Now for me, what I can set mine at is 1070, and that can improve our power draw quite significantly. Now when I'm running my RX 6950 XT at stock, I tend to be drawing around 300 to 320 watts, but running it with this undervolt actually reduces that power draw to around 230 to 250 watts, which is a very impressive drop off in terms of power, and in turn that can actually decrease the noise levels of our card as the fans won't ramp up as much. Now again, this might work for me, but it might not work for everyone else, so you've got to take the time and go through and see what works for yourself. I've looked on a couple of forums and Reddit and seen that some people have actually been able to increase their max frequency and reduce their voltage even better than what I have for here, so it is going to depend on how well binned your GPU is. But overall, it is worth taking a look and seeing how overclocking and undervolting affects yourself, and whether it's worthwhile to actually use either option. But I hope from today's video I've been able to elaborate a little further and help you in achieving a bit more of a better understanding of exactly how to fine-tune your AMD GPU. So that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed it, then please feel free to like and subscribe for more videos on the way soon. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at PCJack94. If you'd like to talk more about myself and love like-minded hardware enthusiasts, then make sure to check out the PCJack Discord server. If you'd like to support the channel even further though, then make sure to check out the channel memberships, which can get you a load of exclusive perks from only 99p a month, including early access to videos, but make sure to check it out. I'll include links to all those in the video description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.